people would be, wondering about you. You'd be called names. We can't have that. We are facing another ism, just like we face Nazism and fascism and imperialism and communism. This is Islamism, and it is a vicious cancer inside the body of 1.7 billion people on this planet, and it has to be excised. So, and we should not fear this idea. We should define it clearly, and we should go after it.
The FBI is responsible for more terrorism plots in the United States than any other organization. More than Al-Qaeda, more than Al-Shabaab, more than the Islamic State, more than all of them combined. This isn't likely how you think about the FBI. You probably think of FBI agents gunning down bad guys like John Dillinger or arresting corrupt politicians. After the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the FBI became less concerned with gangsters and crooked elected officials. The new target became terrorists, and the pursuit of terrorists has consumed the FBI. Every year, the Bureau spends $3.3 billion on domestic counterterrorism activities. Compare that to just $2.6 billion combined for organized crime, financial fraud, public corruption, and all other types of traditional criminal activity. I've spent years poring through the case files of terrorism prosecutions in the United States, and I've come to the conclusion that the FBI is much better at creating terrorists than it is at catching terrorists. In the 14 years since 9/11, you can count about 6 real terrorist attacks in the United States. These include the Boston Marathon bombings in 2013, as well as failed attacks, such as the time a man named Faisal Shahzad tried to deliver a car bomb to Times Square. In those same 14 years, the Bureau, however, has bragged about how it's foiled dozens of terrorism plots. In all, the FBI has arrested more than 175 people in aggressive undercover counterterrorism stings. These operations, which are usually led by an informant, provide the means and opportunity, and sometimes even the idea, for mentally ill and economically desperate people to become what we now term terrorists. After 9/11, the FBI was given an edict. Never again. Never another attack on American soil. FBI agents were told to find terrorists before they strike. To do this, agents recruited a network of more than 15,000 informants nationwide, all looking for anyone who might be dangerous. An informant can earn $100,000 or more for every terrorism case they bring to the FBI. That's right, the FBI is paying mostly criminals and con men 6 figures to spy on communities in the United States, but mostly Muslim American communities. These informants nab people like Abu Khalid Abdul Latif and Wali Mujahid. Both are mentally ill. Abdul Latif had a history of huffing gasoline and attempting suicide. Mujahid had schizoaffective disorder. He had trouble distinguishing between reality and fantasy. In 2012, the FBI arrested these 2 men for conspiring to attack a military recruiting station outside Seattle with weapons provided, of course, by the FBI. The FBI's informant was Robert Childs, a convicted rapist and child molester who was paid $90,000 for his work on the case. This isn't an outlier. In 2009, an FBI informant who had fled Pakistan on murder charges led 4 men in a plot to bomb synagogues in the Bronx. The lead defendant was James Cromedy, a broke Walmart employee with a history of mental problems. And the informant had offered him $250,000 if he participated in that plot. There are many more examples. Today, The Intercept published my new story about a counterterrorism sting in Tampa involving Sami Osmakash, a young man who was living near Tampa, Florida. Osmakash also had schizoaffective disorder. He too was broke, and he had no connections to international terrorist groups. Nonetheless, an FBI informant gave him a job, handed him money, introduced him to an undercover agent posing as a terrorist, and lured him in a plot to bomb an Irish bar. But here's what's interesting. The lead undercover agent, you can see him in this picture with his face blurred, would go back to the Tampa field office with his recording equipment on. Behind closed doors, FBI agents admitted that what they were doing was farcical. A federal judge doesn't want you to hear about these conversations. He sealed the transcripts and placed them under a protective order in an attempt to prevent someone like me from doing something like this. Behind closed doors, the lead agent, the squad supervisor, described their would-be terrorist as a retarded fool who didn't have a pot to piss in. They described his terrorist ambitions as wishy-washy and a pipe dream scenario. But that didn't stop the FBI. They provided Sami Osmakash everything he needed. They gave him a car bomb, they gave him an AK-47, They helped him make a so-called martyrdom video, and they even gave him money for a taxi cab so he could get to where they wanted him to go. As they were working the sting, the squad supervisor tells his agents he wanted a Hollywood ending. And he got a Hollywood ending. When Sammy Osmakash attempted to deliver what he thought was a car bomb, he was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Sammy Osmakash isn't alone. He's one of more than 175 so-called terrorists for whom the FBI has created Hollywood endings. US government officials call this the war on terror. It's really just theater, a national security theater, with mentally ill men like Sammy Osmakash, unwitting actors in a carefully choreographed production brought to you by the FBI. Thank you.
Before I do that, I just want to drill down on something. This is a group of professionals, and I want to make sure that we're all speaking at the same level. Understand that the Quran, the scripture, and even the hadith, which are the legal sunnah, those sunnah that have legal implications, in and of itself, while it's the basis of Sharia, the threat doctrine, in and of itself, it's somewhat meaningless. In the same way that in the Torah or the New Testament, there is the lex talionis, an eye for an eye. It literally says that. But what comes on top of that is everything. Sharia is scripture and it is hadith. But what it really is millennia of usul al-fiqh, the science of Islamic jurisprudence, fiqh. That doctrine tells the devout Muslim what abrogation is. It tells the devout Muslim how to read any particular surah. The problem that Zuhdi has, and I'm a great admirer of Zuhdi's, and we have all kind of gone back and forth on that. But the problem he does have is if you're going to ask any moderate or academic Muslim who wants to read those verses differently than they have been over 1,000 years, he has to figure out a way to, as it were, replace the ulama, the legal authorities. It would be like me saying, I want to interpret the Commerce Clause as it literally says, which is not how it's interpreted. The only way I could do that is to get Andy or someone else appointed to the Supreme Court.
As the rise of radical Islamic jihad, although that's redundant, dominates the headlines, we are seeing this enemy as pure evil as they are cutting off the heads of innocent people. That in August buried literally women and children alive. These are Christians, Christian brothers and sisters. These are Yazidis tonight, who are on Mount Sinjar, and they are continuing to suffer. I recently got an email from a pastor this week who told me there's a missionary working with the Yazidis who are barely clinging to life. They're sleeping in the cold mountains. They don't have blankets. It's a whole different world now, and we can't forget them. We can't forget the others who are persecuted around the world just because of their religious beliefs. And why is that? It's because we have jihadists who are subscribing to this radical ideology that believes that dying in the name of Islam gets them to heaven. This is a spiritual warfare. And what we need to do is defeat Islamic jihad. Sadly, our president has the wrong prescription. He even fails to acknowledge their motivations for bringing about jihad. Yes, Mr. President, it is about Islam. And I believe that if you have an evil, the order of this magnitude, you take it seriously. You declare war on it. You don't dance around. Just like the Islamic State has declared war on the United States of America. You kill their leader. You kill their council. You kill their army until they wave the white flag of surrender. That's how you win a war. And you don't preemptively take anything off the table. You don't advance signal your enemy as to what your intention is. The president asked Congress to follow him in a Vietnam-style slow walk response. And I said no, because either the United States chooses to decisively defeat this brutal evil with every resource we have, or we're going to have to answer to the next generation why we failed to defeat the totalitarian evil of our day. And I also believe the president's decision to train and arm the so-called vetted moderate Syrian rebels is a tragic mistake. Because here is the ugly truth. They will never be vetted. And they certainly aren't all moderates.
We often hear in the media in America, oh my, Muslims, watch out. Terrorists, their religion is not like the other religion. A religion of peace? Of course not. Don't be ridiculous, right? I mean, these guys are far more inclined towards violence than other religions. Well, that's interesting. UC Berkeley political scientist M. Stephen Fish decided, hey, you know what? Why don't I check that out and see if that's true? Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can judge this, and there's a lot of different metrics you can use, but he thought, why not look at the murder rates in Muslim countries and non-Muslim countries and see how they relate? I mean, if there's something intrinsic to the religion of Islam that leads to violence, it might not just show itself in terms of terrorism or wars. And remember, it's not like the Muslims started the war in Iraq. We started the war in Iraq, right? And then a lot of violence broke out. But murder is a different category. It's, intentional homicide, and it's judged based on crime statistics. So let's check that out, okay? I thought that's an interesting idea. So he explains, predominantly Muslim countries average 2.4 murders per annum per 100,000 people, compared to 7.5 in non-Muslim countries. What? The percentage of the society that is made up of Muslims is an extraordinarily good predictor of a country's murder rate. So get a load of this. More Muslims equals less murder. Republicans, conservatives, all you, everybody in the media, go ahead. This is the time when your head explodes. And not due to Muslims. No way, man, I don't believe it. Oh, facts suck. No way. I read a poll that they like to have their women's heads covered. No, yeah, okay, that's all interesting, right? But these are the numbers. You can go check them yourself, okay? So the non-Muslim countries have murder rates 3 times higher. So now I know what a lot of smart people are thinking. Wait a minute now. There's a lot of different factors that go into that. Yeah, you're right. So let's just read up on the rest of the context of this, and then we'll talk about it. It says, more authoritarianism in Muslim countries does not account for the difference. I have found that controlling for political regime and statistical analysis does not change the findings. More Muslims, less homicide. See, because if I would have thought the same thing. Hey, look, a lot of these countries, unfortunately, are under authoritarian leadership. And now if you got a guy who's a dictator and who's going to, have severe consequences for you, if there's crime, maybe that affects the numbers. But he controlled for that, and he found that it does not affect the numbers. Okay. How about if you took out some of the troublesome Christian countries? There are countries, by the way, when they're troublesome, they're not called Christian countries. They are countries that happen to be Christian, right? But there's huge murder rates in some of those countries. So he thought of that. He said, Fish further fleshed out these findings, for example, by rerunning the numbers to exclude non-Muslim majority states with extraordinarily high murder rates. Colombia, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Jamaica, Lesotho, South Africa, and Venezuela. Countries with lots of Muslims were still less murder-prone by a pretty large margin. Okay. Now, do I believe that there is something inherent in Muslim people that makes them less violent than other Homo sapiens? Of course not. That argument is as absurd as saying that Muslims are inherently more violent. No, they're human beings. They're exactly the same as the rest of us. Now, could there be something that is in their culture, the socioeconomic conditions, political context that's making the difference? Yes. Now, that's exactly what I say also about terrorism, that it might have something to do with the political context, the socioeconomic conditions, etc., and all that should be studied further. Okay, but the idea that Muslims are inherently more violent in general is counterfactual. It is the opposite of true. Okay? So, now, again, it's not to say that Muslims are lovely people who float up on clouds and who have a different makeup than we do, okay? And who would never do anything wrong. Of course, there's still murders. It's not at the same rate. And there's got to be other explanations for it. But the idea that Muslims are more violent is just not only irrational, but just simply not true. It does not comport with the facts as we have them. So for all of you guys who wanted to consider the Muslims are the worst of the worst, I guess that's a sad day for you. You'll have to go find another group to single out and go, no.
For one thing, it's not a war on terrorism. Terrorism is a tactic. Terrorism is a way to fight. It's a thing you do. We did it in the Revolutionary War. You know, Bush calls these people cowards because they hit and run. What do you think those soldiers did in the American Revolution? They hid behind trees and shot the British who had on these bright red things. Okay, so enough of that one.
Right.
So we're not a war. It's a war on Islam. It really is. It's a war on, in particular, radical Islamists, radical Muslims who want to, and by the way, will, because you can't beat numbers. You can't beat numbers and you can't beat fanaticism. And over the long haul, Europe is becoming Muslimized. It's just going to be really terrific to watch from the freak show standpoint. And I just think the war on terror is another excuse to do a number of things. Most of them have to do with power grabbing in the world and establishing the hegemony of this country so that there's no other threat to us ever again, ever. That's a Wolfowitz point of view, and Richard Pearl and Libby and Cheney and that whole gang.
Well,
Christopher Columbus, one of the great European heroes, turns up on the island of Hispaniola. He was welcomed by the native people. They embraced them. They treated them with fantastic hospitality. His soldiers snatched babies from the breasts of their mothers and dashed their heads against the rocks. Children were fed alive to his dogs. Women's breasts were cut off. He decided to hang 13 of the Native Americans in Hispaniola to recreate the crucifixion of Jesus, plus the apostles. It's true that the majority of people died there of disease. Disease is introduced by the Europeans unwittingly, but many others were driven to death through overwork, direct murder, through starvation, as their resources were taken away. Columbus insisted that everybody bring him a certain amount of gold, and those who failed to do so had their hands cut off. Some were sent back to their villages with their hands and their noses tied round their necks, having been amputated by his soldiers. And what he did there set the pattern for the genocidal extermination of almost all the Native American peoples. 100 million before Columbus made landfall. By the 19th century, that had come down to less than 1 million across the Americas. Overtly endorsed by such revered figures as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who wrote about the necessity of wiping out Native American peoples. In Britain, we present the colonial project as being about teaching the natives table manners and double-entry bookkeeping. In India, the British manufactured a famine in the 1870s out of nothing. There were food surpluses, massive amounts of food. But the governor, Lord Lytton, insisted that this food be exported wholesale to Britain. The ensuing starvation killed at least 12 million people, possibly as much as 29 million people. All relief works were banned except for hard labour in labour camps, where the inmates received the same rations as the inmates of Buchenwald, and where there was a 94% death rate per year. This was all done in the name of liberal free market capitalism. Of course, the British did something similar in Ireland. In Kenya, soon after the Second World War, there was an uprising by the Kikuyu people who wanted their land back. The Kikuyu were herded into concentration camps and fortified villages, almost the entire population of over 1 million people. People were systematically tortured to death. They invented a new kind of pliers whose purpose was first to crush men's testicles and then to cut them off. They raped women with bayonets. They raped men. Similarly, a favoured technique was to ram sand up the rectum with a stick. Sometimes they were rolled up in barbed wire and kicked around the compound. until they bled to death. Some of the British soldiers boasted about this. This is within living memory. The colonial secretary lied about it. The papers documenting it were burnt. The impact of the rich and powerful nations has been so phenomenally murderous and destructive that it has been completely airbrushed from our national consciousness.
Dans les années 1200, il y avait un empire du Mali. Il avait été fondé par Soundiata Keïta. L'empire du Mali avait un État fédéral très organisé avec un parlement. S'imagine, dans les années 1200, un parlement. En Europe, on va juste attendre 6 ou 7 siècles pour arriver à cette chose-là. Et l'État était très organisé, avec une armée, avec un système d'enseignement, avec un trésor public. Il organisait l'extraction et la vente de l'or. Il développait l'agriculture, coton, arachide. Il y avait des centres universitaires extrêmement célèbres à Tombouctou, à Géné ou à Ségou. Et un des successeurs de Keïta, Boubacar II, 2 siècles avant Christophe Colomb, a lancé 2 expéditions maritimes pour découvrir l'Amérique. Donc, pour des gens qui ne sont jamais entrés dans l'histoire, c'est pas mal. Et en fait, ce qui est intéressant, c'est que donc, il y avait toute une économie en Afrique et au Mali. Il y avait une économie avec un commerce, des caravanes qui remontaient de la Gambie, donc de l'ouest de l'Afrique jusqu'à la Méditerranée. C'était effectivement contrôlé, organisé par les Touaregs. C'était un commerce extrêmement prospère. Et quand le colonisateur français est arrivé là, intéressé par les matières premières, qu'est-ce qu'il a fait? Il a totalement disloqué, brisé ce commerce. Pour gérer le commerce et l'économie, il a importé des Libanais et des Grecs. Et ensuite, la grande démocratie française, qu'est-ce qu'elle a fait? Elle a assassiné des milliers de professeurs de langue arabe. Pourquoi? Parce que ce commerce entre toutes ces régions et tous ces pays, quand vous faites du commerce, vous avez besoin d'une langue que tout le monde comprend. Aujourd'hui, c'est l'anglais. Vous voulez faire du commerce, c'est l'anglais. Et à ce moment-là, c'était l'arabe. Et donc, si on voulait détruire ce commerce et que tout soit pour l'exportation vers la France, on a massacré des milliers de professeurs d'arabe à l'époque.
These are the areas of application of subversion. What it means exactly, in case of religion, destroy it, ridicule it, replace it with various sects, cults, which bring people's attention, faith, whether it is naive, primitive, doesn't really matter. As long as the basically accepted religious dogma is being slowly eroded and taken away from the supreme purpose of religion, to keep people in touch with the supreme being, that serves the purpose. Therefore, replace it, accepted, respected religious organizations with fake organizations. Distract people's attention from the real faith and attract them to various different faiths. Education. Distract them from learning something which is constructive, pragmatic, efficient. Instead of mathematics, physics, foreign languages, chemistry, teach them history of urban warfare, natural food, home economy, your sexuality, anything, as long as it takes you away, okay? Social life. Replace traditionally established institutions and organizations with fake organizations. Take away the initiative from people. Take away the responsibility from naturally established links between individuals, group of individuals, and society at large, and replace them with artificially, bureaucratically controlled bodies. Instead of social life and friendship between neighbors, establish social workers institutions. People who are on payroll of whom? Society? No. Bureaucracy. Power structure. Okay. The natural bodies of administration, which are traditionally either elected by people at large or appointed by elected leaders of society, are being actively substituted by artificial bodies the bodies of people, groups of people, whom nobody elected. Never. As a matter of fact, most of the people don't like them at all, and yet they exist. One of such group is media. Who elected them? How come they have so much power? Almost monopolistic power on your mind. They can rape your mind. But who elected them? How come they have a nerve to decide what is good and what is bad for the elected by you, president, and his administration? Who the hell are they? Power structure slowly is eroded by the bodies and groups of people who do not have neither qualification nor the will of people to keep them in power, and yet they do have power. The next step is destabilization. Again, this word says for itself what it is. To destabilize all the relations, all the accepted institutions and organizations in a country of your enemy. How you do it? You don't have to send a battalion of KGB agents to blow up bridges. No. You let them do it themselves. Here it's radicalization. On the stage of destabilization, we cannot come to compromise even within a family. The husband and wife couldn't figure out which is better. Husband wants his kids to eat at the table, and wife wants a child to roam around the room and drop food all over the floor. They cannot come to compromise unless they start a fight. It's impossible to reach a compromise, constructive compromise between neighbors. This stabilization process usually leads directly to the process of crisis. In case of developing nations, that's the area where I was active. The process starts when the legitimate bodies of power, the social structure collapse. It cannot function anymore. So instead, we have artificial body injected into society, such as non-elected committees. You remember I was talking about them here. Social workers who are not elected by people, media who are self-appointed rulers of your opinion, some strange groups which claim that they know how to lead society forward. They don't usually. All they care is how to collect donations and sell their own concocted ideology, mixture of religion and ideology. Here, we have all this artificial body claiming power. If the power is denied to them, they take it by force. In case of Iran, for example, all of a sudden we have revolutionary committees. What kind of revolution? There was no revolution yet, and yet they had the committees. They were taking power of judgment. They had the power of execution, they had the power of legislation, and that they had the power of judicial. All of them combined in one person, who is half-baked intellectual, sometimes graduated from Harvard University or Berkeley. He comes back to his country and he thinks that he knows the answer to all the social, economical problems. Okay? Crisis is when society cannot function any more productively. It collapses, obviously. That's the word for crisis. Could be stopped right here, both as an expert and as an impert. And that takes one step, one very important thing to do. You don't have to expel all the KGB agents from Washington, D.C. The most difficult and at the same time the simplest answer to the subversion is to start it here and even before. By bringing back the society to religion. Something that you cannot touch and eat and put on yourself, but something that rules society and makes it move and preserve it. So the answer to ideological subversion, strangely enough, is very simple. You don't have to shoot people, you don't have to aim missiles and Pershings and cruise missiles at Andropov's headquarters. You simply have to have faith. and prevent subversion. In other words, not to be a victim of subversion. Don't try to be a person who in judo is trying to smash your enemy and being caught by your hand. Don't strike like that. Strike with the power of spirit and moral superiority. If you don't have that power, it's high time to develop it. And that's the only answer.
I'm reasonably optimistic in America and Europe. I'm pessimistic about the Islamic world. I regard Islam as one of the great evils in the world. And I fear that we have a very difficult struggle there.
Why is it more problematic than Christianity, for instance?
There's a belief that every word of the Quran is literally true, and it is, there's a kind of closed-mindedness there which is I think, less present in the former Christendom. Perhaps because we've had long, I don't know quite why, but there's more of a historical tradition of questioning. And we are going to impose our will. And there's an asymmetry. I think in a way we are being too nice. I think that it's possible to be naively over-optimistic. And if you reach out to people who have absolutely no intention of reaching back to you, then you may be disillusioned.
Reserven, die sind hier. Das sind die größten Reserven. Das ist also Saudi-Arabien, Irak und Iran. Das sind die Länder mit den größten Reserven. Und das wird immer so sein. Ja? Das Erdöl wandert nicht. Das ist dort. Wenn Sie jetzt die Weltkarten der Religionen über diese Karte rüberlegen, dann sieht das so aus. Das heißt, die Welt nach Religionen aufgeteilt, dann sehen Sie, christlich ist violett, Nord- und Südamerika ist christlich, Europa ist christlich, abgesehen von Bosnien und Albanien, Australien, Neuseeland sind christlich, Indien ist hinduistisch, China ist atheistisch, ein Einparteiensystem, Sie wissen das, südliches Afrika mehrheitlich christlich, Russland, naja, eine Art Übergangsphase und dieser, ja, das war kommunistisch und ist jetzt wieder langsam christlich, aber das braucht es also nicht ganz klar. Jetzt, dieser grüne Bereich, ja, Entschuldigung, dieser grüne Bereich, das ist der muslimische Raum. Das ist der muslimische Raum. Und jetzt muss man ja nicht analytisch brillant sein, um zu sehen, das Erdöl liegt bei den Muslimen. Nochmals? Und das ist keine Absprache, also die Muslime sind nicht dorthin gegangen, weil sie gehört haben, dass das Erdöl dort ist, sondern sie waren schon vorher dort. Und der Punkt ist ja jetzt der, wenn Sie sich mal die letzten 15 Jahre nochmal vor dem geistigen Auge durchgehen lassen, dann merken Sie, unsere Sicht, ich sage jetzt unsere Sicht als Schweizer, als Christen, ja, auf die Muslime hat sich verschlechtert. Ja? Warum? Vor allem wegen dem 11. September. Damals haben wir dieses Gefühl bekommen von, die Muslime sind Terroristen. Haben wir zwar nie so gesagt, aber machen Sie mal eine Übung. Das ist aus der psychologischen Kriegsführung. Ich mache das jetzt mit Ihnen. Das tut nicht weh. Seien Sie einfach wachsam. Ich sage ein Wort und Sie produzieren ein Bild. Ich sage Banane. Sie müssen das schneller produzieren. Sie müssen sofort eine Banane im Kopf haben. Dann sage ich Stuhl. Polizist. Terrorist. Stopp. Behalten Sie das letzte Bild. Fragen Sie sich, ist das eine Frau von der RAF, 70er Jahre vielleicht? Ein Katholik, Nordirland, Irish Republican Army, jemand von der ETA, Spanien, oder Irgun, jüdische Terrororganisation, Palästina-Kampf. Wenn es das alles nicht war, vielleicht ein bärtiger Mohammed irgendwie. Ich frage jetzt nicht nach einem Handzeichen, weil wenn es das Letzte war, einfach wenn es das Letzte war, dann verbinden Sie Terrorismus mit Muslimen. Und jetzt kommt noch ein weiteres, und das ist einfach eingelagert. Im Großhirn, auch wenn man ein kritisch differenzierter, friedliebender Mensch ist. Das Zweite ist, wenn Sie die Geschichte der letzten 15 Jahre passieren lassen, vor dem geistigen Auge, haben Sie immer wieder das Gefühl, naja, ja doch, ja, war schon irgendwie kohärent. Aber wir machen in der Friedensforschung einen einfachen Trick. Wir vertauschen die Rollen. Und das mache ich jetzt mit Ihnen auch noch kurz. Die Rollentausch ist einfach. Aus Hansli schlägt Susi machen wir Susli schlägt Hansli. Das ist einfach ein Rollentausch. Und dann ist in den letzten 15 Jahren nämlich Folgendes passiert. Vertauschte Rollen. Der Irak hat die USA angegriffen. Das Erdöl wird jetzt von den Irakern kontrolliert. Bush wurde erhängt. Die Amerikaner wurden in diese orangen Anzüge gesteckt, mit Plastiksäcken über den Kopf. Jetzt entstehen irakische Militärbasen. Mehr als 100.000 Amerikaner sind tot. Der Irak hat auch Großbritannien angegriffen, besetzt jetzt das Erdöl der Nordsee, baut permanente Militärlager auf. Libyen hat Frankreich angegriffen, Sarkozy ist tot. Afghanistan ist in Deutschland einmarschiert, um die Demokratie zu fördern, und es kommt immer wieder zu Toten. Stopp! Das waren jetzt die verdrehten Rollen. Ja? Und wenn Sie sich das mal vorstellen, das wäre wirklich passiert, dann denken Sie, meine Güte, wenn das passiert wäre, dann wäre die Welt wirklich ein Tollhaus. Aber das andere, was wirklich passiert ist, da denken viele, ja, nein, doch, ja, so muss das etwa kommen. Ich weiß auch nicht genau, die sind so Massenvernichtungswaffen und Schiiten und Sunniten, habe ich nie richtig begriffen, was die für ein Problem haben, aber dann noch Diktatoren und 9/11 und also ich meine, irgendjemand musste ja hingehen und schauen, dass man vielleicht wieder Demokratie einrichten kann. Ja. Irgendjemand musste ja hingehen und schauen, dass man vielleicht wieder Demokratie einrichten kann. Ja.
Or just like we've done across the entire Muslim world. And it's amazing for you to say that, well, look at all these Muslims, the minute you give them a little bit of freedom, they go wild and they start being all violent. How can you be a citizen of the United States, the country that has generated more violence and militarism in the world over the last 5 or 6 decades, and say, look at those people over there, they are incredibly violent? We play a significant role in what has been happening in the Middle East because we've been interfering and dominating that region in order to have access to the oil.
I wasn't talking about violence,
So,
I was talking about theocracy. That doesn't happen here.
no, well, okay, that doesn't happen here, but at the same time, Iran isn't invading lots of other countries and occupying them for a decade, nor are fundamentalist Muslim countries the way the United States is. So these things are interlinked because we are continuously interfering in that part of the world. And so to say...
Really, it's all our fault?
It's not all our fault, but when you send your military for 6 straight decades into other countries to bomb them, kill their children and women and innocent men, prop up dictators, yeah, you take responsibility for your actions and say, to the extent that that region...
That religion goes back 1,000 years before our revolution, so I don't think we can take all the blame.
I don't think we should. I think we should take a lot of it. And there's lots of bodies and corpses that have been piled up in the name of Christianity and Judaism as well.
Not recently.
Have you heard of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza for the last 50 years, motivated in part by extremist views of Judaism, or the wars in Europe, or the fact that there were generals in the United States saying we have to go and invade and destroy Iraq, a country of 26 million people, because our God is bigger? Lots of religions, not just Islam, produce violence.
Well, if I could just make one quick point about Egypt.
That silly liberal view that all religions are alike because it makes you feel good.
No, it makes you feel good to say our side is better. Those people over there are primitive and violent.
No, it makes you feel good to put a crown on your head and say, I'm a good person. How do I prove that?
You get to ignore the responsibility that your own government has for the violence and instability in the world by saying, look, it's that primitive religion over there.
Islam is just one of many attributes, not a determinative or even particularly central one to this projection of a new Saudi nationalism. Examples of this expression of Saudi nationalism, be it Diriyah, and which includes a historical representation of the evolution of the Saudi state, which makes almost no reference at all to religion, the pilgrimage, Mecca or Medina. And then to El Ula, which is, one should recall, a pre-Islamic site that the Saudis are now turning into a major tourist destination at that, importantly, that pre-Islamic site. So all of this reflects sort of a new way of thinking about what it means to be Saudi, and that's nationalist.